Pull the string!
Scoodly, wow, wow, wow.
Hi, area backstage.
Hi, my name is Steve Sherman, and I'm here at Campbell Con in Campbell, California. And I'm representing the Jack Kirby Museum. I'm from Los Angeles. I grew up there, and like probably every male my age, I grew up on comic books and TV and any kind of cartoon, comic book, you name it, whatever. And as a little kid, I wanted to be a cartoonist. And as a bigger kid, I realized I couldn't draw, so that killed that right there. But I still loved comics and worked in them. And now I'm a puppeteer. For the last 30 years, I became a puppeteer and have a company called Puppet Studio, and we do puppets for film and TV and live theater.
I think I'm in a lot of trouble.
Stromboli's amazing marionette show.
Ow! Read, huh?
Yeah, I'm into it. Sure, yes.
With O.G. Reedmore as your host.
We were
We went to work for Marvel Mania, which where Mark Evanier and I went to work there along with a couple other people from the comic club. And it was through that we met Jack Kirby. And that was my first entrance into comics. First published work was probably Spirit World. I think that had, Mark and I did some stuff for Spirit World that actually had our byline on it. I wish I could say that it was Jack Kirby that gave me my influence, but it really wasn't. I didn't discover him until much later. I was more into like cartoony type drawing, animation and animators. Woody Woodpecker comics and Bugs Bunny comics and that kind of stuff, more so than the superhero genre. But as I got older, of course, and started reading the Marvel comics, I became a big Jack Kirby fan. I have to say, I went to the very first San Diego Comic Con, which was held in a basement of the U.S. Grand Hotel in San Diego. I also went to the 1970 New York Comic Con, which Phil Suling put on, which was at the time one of the biggest comic conventions there at the time. And this was 40 years ago. So in that time, I've seen the San Diego Comic Con become 150,000 plus people attending. And like things like Campbell Con on the opposite end, but still drawing crowds of people interested in pop culture. And I noticed today, sitting here, just how many kids there are running around in superhero costumes, which is pretty funny because back in the day, we were just teenagers and stuff, swapping comic books back and forth, and that was the comic convention. But now they're all over the place. I think you can go to one every week if you want to. So it's really just something that's sort of become part of the culture just over the past 50 years, I'd say. Now, the thing is, prior to, let's say, the Marvel comics of the 60s that brought in Spider-Man and things like that, before that, comics were like, bad news. From the 1950s into the late 50s, they would have congressional hearings on comic books. That's how much people feared them. I mean, it was just, these things are bad. Because what happened was, during the post-war period, from 45 to 50, comics were selling like crazy. You could put out just about anything and it would sell, because you had all these people coming back who had been reading comics during the war. But as television came in and things like that, comics started to lose sales. So what they tried to do is jazz it up, which meant more horror, more graphic depictions of horror and murders and things like that, that suddenly people were saying were the cause of juvenile delinquency from these kids reading these horror comics. So, it was a time when everybody was running scared about everything. So they finally came up with the Comics Code, which was a self-imposed regulation by the comics publishers to drive out the one guy who was publishing these horror comics and keep their businesses intact. So after that, they just cleaned them up and they became, not as gory, not as graphic. But we're talking about, 56, 57. I mean, nowadays, you can buy heavy metal comics with people's heads being pulled off, zombie comics and all that. So I guess it's come full circle, hasn't it? Right now I have a company called Puppet Studio in North Hollywood, California. And my partner, Greg Williams, and I, we construct, build, and perform puppets for TV and film, live theater. We just finished building 3 sets of puppet characters for Princess Cruises for their Magic to Do show. And we have 3 numbers in that, one of which is a shadow puppet number, which is pretty cool. So if you're ever going to go on a cruise, go on Princess and go see the show. And what else have we? Oh, we just finished building some puppets for the new Adam Sandler film that's going to be on Netflix. We built some clown puppets for that. I think you're just going to see them by the feet. I'm not sure, but look for that. And that's about what I do now, is build puppets. Hi, I'm Steve Sherman. I'm here at Campbell Con in Campbell, California, and you're watching Bay Area Backstage.
Hi, I'm Bruce Simon. I'm at Campbell Con in Campbell, California, and you're watching Bay Area Backstage. I became a cartoonist professionally in 1972 and sold to comics to underground newspapers and packaged and put together underground comics for Print Mint, Cartoonist Co-op Press, Last Gasp, and all that, and did that until about 1982 when the bottom fell out of the business. So, but I had a nice run for about a dozen years doing cartooning, and I'm glad to be back being a has-been Euster was here at the Campbell Con. The underground comic scene in San Francisco, most of the artists live there, like Art Crumb and Gilbert Shelton and Bill Griffith and Kim Deitch, and it was a great scene. It was when San Francisco had a very active and vibrant comic scene, lots of activity going on. And the cartoonists would get together. There was a union, the Comic Workers of America, where we would get together periodically and meet about page rates and who's printing and who's not printing and how we're going to make a living and whatever. It was a wonderful scene, very nice people, very dynamic time. Eventually, like most scenes, one person moves here and one person moves there. Crumb and Shelton moved to France, and some of them died and some moved here and there. So the comic scene in San Francisco is quiet these days. There's still a few of us left around here. And with the 50th anniversary of the first underground comics coming next year, it should be interesting to see if there's any events around that. Well, the comic scene is a lot different than it was these days. There's tons and tons of independent comics. I wouldn't call them undergrounds, although there's still some that probably would qualify. Lots of independent cartoonists working for big publishers, little publishers, which is great. The main companies, Marvel and DC, are now giant media conglomerates. But what's interesting now is that people enjoy the characters, the mainstream characters like Batman and Iron Man and Spider-Man, but they don't associate them with comic books per se. They're characters they like to watch on television or in movies or to wear as a costume, but in a lot of respects it doesn't even register on them that they were there's such a thing as a comic book or that you can read about them, which I find very odd. What I do now is I have a business called Kinney Video Vintage Television, and I have an archive of some of the earliest recorded television programs beginning from the beginning of network television in 1948, which is close to 70 years old now. I put together compilations of these shows. I sell them to collectors. I sell them to museums, to colleges that have media centers, to research facilities. I've sold them to studios, movie studios, and even supplied the television networks with shows that they didn't have copies of anymore. So it's an interesting line of work. And what's even more interesting that people consider old television now Seinfeld, and I don't consider anything old unless it was from before 1960. So there's quite a gap. Television. I was a child of the first television generation in the 50s, and now with 60 plus years of television, that's an awful lot of lousy TV to go through. Back in 1969, some friends of mine in high school, we had what was called the Old Time Movie Club, where we had a 16-millimeter projector, and we would rent 16-millimeter features, which you could do back then. And at a local park, we had an auditorium. We set up chairs, and you could put an ad in the Los Angeles Times, because this took place in L.A., and charge people 25 cents or 50 cents to come and see a movie, and they would do that. Imagine that. And one day a fellow showed up with all these reels of 16-millimeter film, and he didn't have a projector, so he asked if we could project it for him. And they turned out to be television kinescopes from the 1950s, but because before videotape, they would have either a 16 or 35 millimeter film camera take a picture of a live monitor during broadcasts, and that's how they would have a copy to show. For example, Ed Sullivan would be on Sunday at 8 o'clock in New York. They would make a kinescope film print, send it to Los Angeles, and Los Angeles would watch the show 1 week later. So they had all these shows on film. They didn't rerun these shows, and so this person was outside CBS Television City in West Los Angeles and saw them dumping mountains of cans of film into the garbage because they didn't want to store them anymore and considered them just junk. And they were things like, live programs with stars like Jack Benny. One of them was a live Jack Benny program with only one of two programs that Humphrey Bogart ever appeared on television, and it was in the garbage. Another film was a 1-hour pilot film that was never broadcast, starring Groucho Marx, and an invaluable bit of history thrown in the garbage. So once I realized that, I got involved with people all over the country who had been saving films like that. And so it's been a close to 50-year journey through old television. Well, see, film is film, and that can be transferred to digital formats. The first videotape was first came into use in the mid-50s, and the tapes were 2 inches wide, and a 15-minute reel of tape would be as big as a car tire, and it was incredibly expensive. So many of those shows don't exist anymore because the film was so expensive. They would just back up the tape and keep taping over it, and so all the previous shows would disappear. So there's thousands and thousands of programs that just got routinely wiped off of tape and that we'll never see again. Yeah. My latest, I do I do some reprints of my old comics. My eyes aren't what they used to be, but I do periodically do illustrated essays for a magazine called Mineshaft that comes out of Durham, North Carolina, and a lot of the underground artists still, do art and writing for that just to keep their hand in. And that's what I do along with the television, and it keeps me occupied. There's some really terrific artists right now. I would recommend the books of Noah Van Sciver. Very good. He has a new book out called St. Cole, which is out from Fantagraphics. Another book of his is Fanti Bukowski. A great guy. I think he's going to be a terrific talent. I have friends, Mimi Pond, who used to draw underground comics in the old days, and she's still around, and she's doing books. One's called Over Easy, and the other one is called The Customer is Always Wrong, and they're a memoir of her life in Oakland in the mid-'70s, which is a great representation of the time. They're very funny, very funny. I'd recommend them highly. But there's tons of people doing great work now. There's probably better comics now than there have ever been. They're just not coming from DC or Marvel. Find me at the web at www.kinneyvideo.net. And that's Kinney Video Vintage Television.
Destroy